recording. I am recording now. Hello. Yes. Oh, yeah. That means yep, you gotta mute yourself. And I gotta deafen myself. There we go. Alright. Hello. We are back, and I'm going to read another book to you guys. Super fun and exciting. So, this one is called Just Ella, and I will show you a picture of it. There we go. That's a pretty nice cover of the book. Alright, let me show you on here. That's what the book looks like right here. Just Ella by Margaret Peterson Haddix. It's a pretty old book. Well, like 10 plus years. Anyway. Yeah, and I'll read you, well, it's just about Cinderella, but gone wrong. Like, she doesn't want to marry the prince anymore, that sort of thing. She doesn't want to be in the royal court or anything like that. Probably spoilers, but not really. It's just like the reality of not everything is fairy tales and rainbows. Okay, so I'm gonna have to push this over here. Oh, that's way too bright. There we go. All right. So yeah, I guess we'll start. Exciting, guys. Super exciting. All right. So Just Ella by Margaret Peterson Haddix. Also pretty grateful because the font is, I might say, a lot bigger than Maybird and a lot more spread out. So I'll probably be reading this pretty fast. I'm not sure though. But yeah. So chapter 1, and there's no titles to the chapters. It's just chapter 1 and that. So I think I'll read until like chapter 4 or maybe chapter 5. I haven't decided yet. Anyway, how about until 10:30? Yeah, that sounds good. Until 10:30. All right. So, chapter 1. The fire had gone out, and I didn't know what to do. I was covered with the king's ransom of silk-sewn comforters and surrounded by 6 warming pans. so it was still mostly warm. But my nose was exposed and freezing, and I heard no friendly crackling from the direction of the hearth. For some reason, the chambermaid in charge of keeping my fire going had overslept or or forgotten me, or perhaps I had awakened too early, before it was time for her to come on duty. I hadn't figured out. Hold on. There we go. I had my headphones on, and it felt weird. Or perhaps I had awakened too early, before it was time for her to come on duty. I hadn't figured out the palace work schedule yet. The last time I awoke to freezing air and a dead fire, I simply got up and restarted it myself. Ella, I lectured myself, you're no stranger to tending fireplaces. Just because they put a crown on your head does, doesn't mean your hands forgot how to work. Still, I had to force myself to leave the bed's warmth, tiptoe across the icy flagstones, and search for a tinder box and poker. For a while, that was I feared none of that was in my room. Did they think princesses or almost princesses were too delicate? Hold on. For for a while, I feared none of that. Yeah, for a while, I feared that none of that was in my room. Did they think princesses or almost princesses were too delicate even to see the instruments that kept them warm? But then I found a compartment in the wall by the great fireplace and dragged out equipment bigger and grander than I'd ever used before. Reviving the fire as it Reviving the fire was a struggle, for my hands were clumsy after 2 weeks of idleness. I hardly count needlepoint as work. At the end, when I was finally able to warm my numb fingers over ever growing flames, I felt a strange surge of pride. I wanted to brag to someone about accomplishing a chore I'd done hundreds of times in my own in my old life without thinking. But there was no one to tell. But there was n- yeah, but there was no one to tell. Charm wouldn't be interested, even if I saw him in between his endless hunts and contests. The king would was even more remote, and I'd endured enough blank stares from the queen to know I shouldn't confide anything in her. Then there were all my ladies in waiting and maid servants and my instructors, one for decorum, one for dancing, one for palace protocol, one for needlepoint, one for painting, and two or three whose purposes I had yet to figure out. Hold on for just a second. I need to. My lips are dry. Yeah. But all of them looked at me with such horror whenever I let something slip about my former life. What? You had no one to do your laundry? One of the silliest of my waiting girls, Cipriana, had asked when I'd carelessly mentioned rinsing out my stockings after the ball. Even after just 2 weeks, I knew better than to brag to anyone in the castle about doing something that dirtied my hands. And so I thought I'd keep my fire building secret. Then I overheard two of my maidservants gossiping later that day about my chambermaid. She was still found in her bed, and it was already past 5 o'clock. The one said to the other, fluffing my pillows with a dainty thump. In the castle, even the maids pretend to be dainty. No, the other gasped. So she was. No. I should have said that instead. Let me reverse back. I feel like I've lost my reading touch. Just kidding. She was found still in her bed, and it was already past 5 o'clock. The one said to the other, fluffing my pillows with a dainty thump. In the castle, even the maids pretended to be dainty. No, the other gasped. So she was beaten within an inch of her life and dismissed, the first said, sounding as self-satisfied as rabble cheering an execution. Thrown out of the palace gate by 6. Lazy slug-a-bed. Got exactly what she deserved then, the second said, even as she gently placed a single rose on my pillow. But the fire! But the fire! They both fell silent and glanced my way. I lowered my eyes and pretended to be intent on the watercolor I was copying over in the afternoon light, struggling through the western window. I didn't know why I cared what maids thought or why I acted as though restarting a fire to heat my own room was something to be ashamed of. After a moment, one said, and then the other echoed her, and then they left. I sighed, glad to be alone, but then Madame Bisset, my decorum instructor, arrived in a flurry. If it had been someone else, I would have said she was disheveled or flustered. But, of course, Madame Bisset never allowed herself to be anything but absolutely perfect in bearing and dress. Every gleaming silver hair was in place. Every one of the 52 tiny mother-of-pearl buttons that marched up her dress was precisely flattened in its loop. And she looked as though she'd given thought to appearing disheveled, as though circumstances might warrant it from anyone else. Princess Cynthiana Eleonora, she said sternly as she sat down, discreetly arranging the yards and yards of fabric in her skirt so she would be comfortable on the sofa. I have heard a rumor. The unfamiliar name and title jarred as always. I'd only recently managed to stop myself from looking around when people addressed me like that, a princess. Where? Oh, that's right. Me. Sort of. Madam? A rumor? I murmured, trying to get the pronunciation of Madame correct, exactly right. The day before, Madame Bisset had chided me for how she lowered her voice to whisper the horrifying phrase. Common, my French sounded. This Madame evidently passed muster, because Madame Bisset's frown didn't deepen immediately. So I worried instead that I was breaking some rule against echoing another speaker's words. But no, it was my father who had opposed that. I could hear his dry voice. I'd prefer to hear an original thought if you have one. I couldn't imagine Madame Bisset caring about my thoughts, original or otherwise. A rumor, she said firmly. Now, normally a cultured woman does not listen to rumors or gossip. Au contraire, one must hold oneself above such crudity. But this rumor is so appalling, it must be dealt with. And since I am the person responsible for instilling you with a sense of etiquette, I must not shirk. She sniffed daintily and dramatically, fully conveying both her dedication and her responsibilities and her distaste for the subject she was about to discuss. My first few days in the palace, when I still dared, I would have joked. You mean it's a dirty job, but somebody's gotta go do it. But I'd learned. Now, the servants are saying, her inflection on servants. Her inflection on servants carried the full weight of her disgust at being put in a position having to quote servants. The servants are saying you lit your own fire this morning. I did, I said in a small voice. Madame Bisset gasped and went pale. She leaned back against the sofa. I wondered if I was going to have to call for smelling salts. You must never do that again, she said in a surprisingly firm voice. Never. A proper lady would have bowed her head in shame and murmured, "Yes, Madame Bisset," but no one had thought of training me to be proper until 2 weeks earlier. So my instincts were all wrong. Why? I asked, truly curious. Madame Bisset gasped again, as if I were beyond hope if I had to ask. She took a deep breath, as deep as her corsets allowed, anyway. You have no idea why you should not light your own fire. It was a question without being a question, a trick. I'd be rude to answer it, perhaps interrupting her next thought, but I'd be more rude not to answer, as she was waiting for a reply. These were the games I had to play now. No, I ventured. Or, I'm not really as stupid as you think. I mean, I know princesses usually don't do things like that. But I was cold and... You were cold? Madame Bisset said. A lesser woman would have rolled her eyes. Not Madame Bisset, of course, but the muscles around her eyelids twitched ever so slightly, as if they knew what was possible. You were cold. Did you perchance remember you have a bell to call your servants? Did you remember that it was their job to tend your fire? Yes, but... I looked down, knowing that if I kept looking at Madame Bisset, she'd see that I suddenly wanted to cry. I almost whispered, but I didn't want to disturb anyone. I looked up in time to see Madame Bisset holding back an explosion. The color in her face rose like a thermometer. First deathly white, then fiery red, clear up to the roots of her curled black hair. You must never ever hesitate to disturb a servant, she said, shooting off each word like an arrow, precise and cruel. That's what they're there for. They exist solely to serve us. She closed her eyes, then opened them slowly. You may think you're being kind, she said, the strain of trying to sound understanding weighing her in her voice. But servants know their place. They like to serve. They are hurt if you make them feel useless, purposeless, and they cannot respect a member of the nobility who lowers herself to their level, to their work. She said work, like it was a curse word. I clenched my teeth. I clenched my teeth, an ugly habit I'd been told again and again. But if I opened my mouth, I knew the angry words would spill out. What did Madame Bisset know about how servants felt and thought? Why did she think anyone would get any pleasure out of serving lazy, selfish, self centered people like her? I knew. I'd been there. Not a servant, quite, but close enough. I'd had no respect for the ones I waited on, to begin with. If they'd so much as raised a finger to help me, the question was, would I have been able to stop hating them? Do you understand? Madame Bisset asked, the way you'd asked a simpleton. I lowered my eyes and made a stab at at, at priority, at propriety. Yes, Madame Bisset. I looked up, unable to resist another question. The maidservant. I heard she was dismissed. If I'd thought to ring for her, would she would she still have been Madame Bisset sniffed. Of course. She overslept. So now, cold again, I dared not get up. I couldn't start my own fire or ring for the maid or and get and risk getting another girl fired. I could only pray that she woke on her own and crept down here without being discovered. Wait, hold on. So now, cold again, I dared not get up. I couldn't start my own fire or ring for the maid or risk getting another girl fired. I could only pray that she woke on her own and crept down here and without being discovered. I willed her to awaken, as if I could send my thoughts up 3 flights of narrow, winding stairs to shake her awake. I listened for the distinctive creak of my door, the one I so often pretended to sleep through, because I didn't know what to say to people doing work for me that I was perfectly capable of doing myself. But the door didn't open. I got colder. This wasn't what I had imagined at the ball, the stars wheeling above me as I danced with the prince. Truthfully, I didn't imagine anything. Just being at the ball was beyond my wildest dreams, and then everything happened so fast. The prince seeking me for his bended knee proposal, everyone making wedding plans, me returning to the castle to stay for good. I remembered an old neighbor woman cackling as I rode by, astonished in the prince's carriage. Now, now, there's one who will live happily ever after. I was cold. I was lonely. I was engaged to be married in 2 short months to the most handsome man I'd ever met, the prince of the land, the heir to the throne. But I had never felt so alone in all my life, not even shivering in rags in my garret the day they came to say my father was dead. This was happiness? And that is the end of chapter 1. I forgot it started out that way, that she already started out in the palace. But yeah, you could see that it's fucking cool. Right? Hold on just 1 second. Someone commented on my thing. I'm gonna like it. And I'm gonna say thank you. Hmm. I think this is a bot. Pretty sure it's a bot. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a bot. Yeah. It's a bot. Because they just joined fucking a month ago and they already have like 73,000 subscribers. And I'm just like, yeah, you a bot. I know. But hey, it's okay. I'm not gonna subscribe to them and they can't get my monies. They can't get my information. I mean, so that's the good part. Anyway, also, I'm gonna readjust myself because I need to do that. Okay. All right. But yeah, I'm liking reading this book again. Haven't read this book in a while. Okay. So now we go to chapter 2. Chapter 2. Um, yeah. Chapter 2. I'm like, yeah, it has a title. No, it doesn't. Okay. Chapter 2. I must have fallen back asleep because when I opened my eyes again, there was a weak fire throwing shadows on the wall. Sunlight streamed in through one high, narrow window, doing its best to brighten the dark room. I hadn't known this, having stepped foot in a castle only once. Excuse me. I hadn't known this, having stepped foot in a castle only once before I came to stay for good. But castles are dim, gloomy places full of shadows, even at noon on the brightest day. My eyes had not adjusted. As a child, I had lived more out of doors than in, until my father taught me to read, just to keep me in the house. And even then, I'd sneak his books outside and read them under the shade of the hazel tree, or while dangling my bare feet in the creek behind our house. And now, I hadn't been outside the castle walls once since I arrived. Aren't princesses supposed to know horsemanship or anything like that? Shouldn't someone be giving me some sort of lessons outside? I resolved to ask. I resolved to ask. The thought cheered me. The thought cheered me so much. I sprang out of bed and began scrubbing my face with vigor. 4 hours later, I was on my third lesson of the morning, and I still hadn't found an opportunity to ask anything. How could conversational French, dining table etiquette, and royal genealogy take so much time? Actually, royal genealogy would have interested me if it had been the kind my father used to talk about, where kings went crazy or the single peasant's whisper in a prince's ears changed the entire fate of a nation. In the history Lord Reston described for me in his dry, dull, droning voice, everyone was upstanding and perfect, and absolutely nothing of interest ever happened. uh, And the next and then the next thing, Charming the Ninth was known as and then the next and then the next thing and then the next king, Charming the Ninth, was known as the Bridges King because he ordered the building of thousands of bridges throughout the land, and every bridge and uh, let me read. I keep on like reading this in like a weird voice. Well, not weird, but I need to change it up a bit. And then the king, and then the next king, Charming the Ninth, was known as the Bridges King because he ordered the building of thousands of bridges throughout the land, and every bridge was strong and true and lasted for hundreds of years, he said, his hands resting on his enormous stomach. He looked like a huge pig stuffed into men's clothing. I thought of warning him never to go to the Haymarket fair held in our village every summer, because boys there put clothes and wigs on pigs and chased them for sport, and he wouldn't want to be mistaken for a particularly well-dressed pig. I'd hate to think of Lord Reston. I'd hate to think of Lord Reston trying to run. Some of the bridges exist even to this. Lord Reston's drones Lord Reston's drone stopped abruptly. He gasped, soundlessly, a stricken look on his face. Lord Reston? Are you all right? I asked. Lord Reston? His head lolled to the side, his tongue hanging out of his mouth. His face went gray. Lord Reston? Lord Reston! Frantically, I pouted at his collar hidden beneath rolls of double chin. I popped out I popped off his top button and undid his cravat. He had to get air. Why wasn't he breathing? Help! Somebody help! I screamed. The castle walls were too thick for anyone to hear me unless they were right outside the door. Nobody came. I tugged and pulled on Lord Reston's arms and legs, thinking that if I could get him flat on the floor, perhaps the air would come in more easily. Even after my years of carrying buckets and firewood, moving him took every ounce of my strength. Finally, he fell from the chair with a thud. I straightened out his body, trying to make him more comfortable. I thought I saw his chest moving up and down, ever so slightly, but I didn't stop to make sure. I'll be right back, Lord Reston, I shouted. Sorry, I'm gonna have to hold on. Okay. I'll be right back, Lord Reston, I shouted over my shoulder as I raced for help. I promise. Out in the hall, I lifted my skirts to run. There had to be maids about in the next chamber, or the next, and one of them could go for a and then one of them could go first for a physician. If only I could find one who knew or cared enough to run as fast as she could. Turning the corner, I collided with a serving girl. A child, really, no more than 10 or 11. Go get the court physician, I commanded. Tell him Lord Reston is dying in my room. Yes, Princess, she said, sweeping into her graceful curtsy. There's no time for that. Run! I commanded. Obediently, she stopped mid-curtsy and fled. I rushed back to my room, praying I wouldn't find Lord Reston already dead. A stench told me he was still alive enough to have fouled himself. I knelt beside him. Lord Reston, can you hear me? I took his cold hand in mine, wishing I hadn't been so cruel as to think of him as a pig. He may have had he may have been pompous and dull, but surely he had a family, people who loved him. Uh, he grunted. That's good, I said encouragingly. I'm glad in your I'm glad you're in there, but don't try to talk if it hurts. I bent him over, putting my ear to his chest to listen for his heartbeat. It was there, but faint and sluggish, as if his heart were not quite sure the next thump thump was worth the effort. Princess! Whatever are you doing? I turned, and there was Madame Bisset arriving for my next lesson. It's Lord Reston. He's taken ill. Do you know anything about? I stopped because Madame Bisset was looking at me in such horror. She'd gone white. It's His Excellency, the Lord Reston, she corrected. I hardly thought a title mattered under the circumstances. And a true princess, she continued, pronouncing each word with great effort, would never lie on the floor with her head on a man's chest. A man's bare chest. She swayed ever so slightly, prepared to faint. I looked down and saw that Lord Reston's shirt was open practically to his waist, his immense girth spilling out. Hastily, I tried to pull his waistcoat together, but the effort was in vain. I scrambled up and helped Madame Bisset to the chaise lounge. I'm afraid he's dying, I said. I don't I didn't know what to do. That's what the that's what doctors are for, Madame Bisset said. Weak weakly, she That's what doctors are for, Madame Bisset said weakly, her eyes closed. Yes, I sent for one, I said irritably. I glanced over at Lord Reston, who probably was dying as we spoke. But there wasn't a doctor here when he was stricken. Just me. Madame Bisset's only response was to flutter her eyelashes. Just then, the court physician swept into the room. He was a spry little man I had glimpsed only from a distance at formal court functions. He had an entourage of several men, all respectfully standing several steps back. He bowed deeply before even glancing at Lord Reston's body on the floor. Princess, Madame, charmed as ever, he said. Now, I must beg you to excuse us. It took me a minute to realize he meant for us to leave. Madame Bassett, suddenly energized, rose quickly and gave me a stern look that made me feel like a dog being commanded to heel. I followed her out the door. We, we will use my chambers for your lesson today, she said calmly, as if Lord Reston's collapse were not worth mentioning when I still had so much to learn about proper ways to address various visiting dignitaries. They'll tell us how he is, won't they? I asked. I had to walk quickly to keep up with her, but she was gliding as smoothly as if she had heels instead of legs. As heels, wheels. But she was gliding as smoothly as if she had wheels instead of legs, and I was bouncing up and down and half tripping on the layers of my dress. I longed to hike up the skirt again, as I had as I had while one as I had while running for help. But I knew that would make Madame Bassett faint for real. I hadn't realized you were so fond of His Excellency, she said dryly. I'm sure you'll be told whatever is appropriate. That word appropriate took a minute to sink in. No, I wanted to shout. I want to be told whatever's true. But I didn't. But I didn't. Yes, Madame Bassett, I said meekly. And that is the end of chapter 2. Chapter 2. On to chapter 3. Yeah, chapter 3. I sat through the rest of the morning's lessons in a daze, paying even less attention than usual to Madame Siles, the needing point. Sorry, I got distracted. Alright, chapter 3. I sat through the rest of the morning's lessons in a daze, paying even less attention than usual to Madame Siles, the needlepoint instructor, and Lord Axley, who was trying to teach me proper ways of dealing with servants. His lessons had been added only after the fireplace fiasco. At the noon meal with my ladies in waiting, I barely noticed the conversation, which was a silly stream of chatter about who had what color ribbons in their hair and why. I was pondering an experiment. If I didn't ask, how long would it be for anyone if I didn't ask, how long would it be before anyone told me how Lord Reston was? And would anybody ever say to me, "Gosh, that must have been awful for you, seeing him collapse like that. If that ever happens again, here's how you can help." I didn't think so. I dunked an edge of bread into my soup. The bread was made of the finest ground white flour in the kingdom, and it was served only in the castle. The luxury was lost on me. It seemed tasteless compared to the coarse brown bread Mrs. Branson made back in my village, and had sometimes shared with me if there was any left over after her husband and 10 children ate. My mouth watered at the memory. Maybe once my place in the council was a little more established, once I wasn't being chastised for trying to save a man's life, maybe I could convince whoever controlled such things to make Mrs. Branson an extra royal baker. The Bransons could certainly use the money, though Lucille, my stepmother, would be outraged that I was helping the Bransons and not her or my stepsisters. I imagined saying to any of the step evil I imagined saying to any of the step evils, "Hey, if you want to bake bread, that's great, but I thought none of you were into that, seeing as how you always made me do all the work." As usual, thinking about the step evils made me feel uncomfortable and guilty and angry all at once. On that dizzying day when Prince Charming found me, when it was clear the glass slipper was mine, and he was going to whisk me off to the palace, the seal had suddenly turned into my best friend, hugging me and going on and on about how she couldn't be happier if it were one of her real daughters becoming a princess, and how she knew from all our heart to heart talks that this was my dearest wish. But wouldn't it be nice if my dear, dear mother and sisters could come to the castle with me? Stepmother, I had corrected quietly. Stepsisters. One of the things that had endeared the prince to me forever was that he'd looked at the pile of rags that I'd cast off, and then looked at Lucille and Griselda and Corimund, Corimund. Is it Corimund? I don't want to get it wrong. Here, this is how it's spelled. Corimund. Or is. Mm, yeah, I think it's. I'm saying it right. Corimund? I'm gonna look it up. Sorry, I got distracted. Yeah, but I think it's Coromund because I just think no, I didn't. I found Coromundi. Yeah, yeah, I found Coromundi, but I didn't found. So I'm just like, yeah. So I'm just gonna say Cormund, hoping that's the correct way to say it. Sorry, I'm just overhearing my mom tell my brother about the whole situation about maybe we're gonna have to close the shop and stuff. Also, listeners, um, I am recording this at 3/16/2020. This probably won't be up until like a month or two. I'm not sure. I should really keep up with the posting, like being really recent, but my life's just hectic, so the posting will be hectic. Anyways, yeah, last week, the COVID or the coronavirus got like out of control. My parents run a shop, and now it's just like, are we gonna have to close it down because it's really slow and all that jazz? And it sucks. It really does. Because we're local and we're a small business and it hits us hard. Can't imagine all the Asian restaurants and food places right now. Must be really hard on them. So support your local businesses. Please, takeout is a thing. Please. Okay. I got just a tiny bit depressed just listening to that because I was working today and goddamn, it was super slow. So we're gonna close earlier. Ugh, scary times. Anyway, let's get back to reading because that's a thing and we want to get back to that because it takes us away from all of this. Yeah, yeah. Let's do that. All right. So, what was I? Okay, there we go. One of the things that had endeared the prince to me forever was that he'd look at the pile of rags that I'd cast off, and then looked at Lucille and Griselda and Coramund and their tacky, expensive finery, and shut the door of the coach right in Lucille's face. I hadn't seen any of the stuff people since. Should I? Should I, for example, ask that they be invited to the wedding? I was so lost in thought that it took me a long time to realize everyone else at the table had suddenly stopped talking and was staring in horror at me. Was I accidentally speaking my thoughts out loud? Raving like the village lunatic? Had I sprouted green hair in front of on my face? Princess, princess, the lady in waiting to my right hissed, and pointed with a severe tilt of her chin. Behind me, the servant girl darted in to wipe up the single drop of soup that had fallen from my bread to the tablecloth. Madame Bassett, seated catty corner and 5 seats down, rose and came to whisper in my ear. Only commoners place their bread into the soup. You must never, never do that again. All right, I said with a jauntiness I didn't feel. I'll be certain to remember that. Everyone returned to their soup again. Nope. Anyways, everyone returned to their soup again, bowing their heads so they didn't have to look at me. A dozen spoons moved in unison, dipping out of the bowls backward so as not to drip, exactly the way Lady Wesley had tried to teach me. Somehow, I didn't think my idea of bread of Somehow, I didn't think my idea of brown bread at the castle would go very well. Would I spend the rest of my life pretending to like white bread? Pretending to Pretending a drop of soup on the tablecloth was a disastrous turn of events? Pretending I was more interested in colored ribbons than in anything else? So, I said in a bit too loudly, has anyone heard how His Excellency the Lord Reston is doing? I was proud I'd remembered to say his full title. Surely Madame Bassett couldn't criticize me now. A flurry of whispers circled the table. I believe, Madame Bassett said calmly, he is resting and doing well. He is he was taken ill during Princess Cynthiana Eleonora's lesson this morning, she explained to the several ladies who were staring from me to her with puzzled expressions. Ill? I wanted to say. He was apoplectic. He almost died in front of me. The other girls and women were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. If they hadn't at all been so refined, I would have said they were squirming. Why does this bother everyone so much? I asked. I mean, I could understand you being concerned about Lord Reston's health, but none of you even want to speak of this. Why? Madame Bassett took it upon herself to speak for everyone. His Excellency's illness is of a particularly unpleasant nature, she said. As you must know, our duty as women is to be protected from unpleasantness, so that our minds and our souls and our brows shall be unsullied by worry. Women were created to be like flowers, providing color and beauty to the world. We leave troubling matters to men. The other women were nodding and murmuring assent. Oh, Madame Bassett, you express yourself so beautifully, the lady beside me said. I considered suggesting that Madame Bassett ask the female servants to in the palace if oh let me say that again. I considered suggesting that Madame Bassett ask the female servants in the palace if they believed they were protected by unpleasantness. I thought of the response she'd get if she'd tried out her theory on the women I knew back in the village. She worked from sunup until sundown, scrubbing and baking and wiping snotty noses. Surely you understand now, Madame Bassett asked. I didn't say yes or no, but let the conversation meander back to ribbons. And that is the end of chapter 3. I think chapter 4 is a longer one. Yeah, that's where we'll leave off on. Chapter 4. Chapter 5, but I'm going to do chapter 4. Alright. Chapter 4. A long, dull afternoon of needlepoint stretched ahead of me, and I was so dawdled leaving the dining room. Oh, no. Um, a long, dull afternoon of needlepoint stretched ahead of me, and I dawdled leaving the dining room. That meant I was alone for when I felt a timid. That meant I was alone when I felt a timid tug on my dress. Please, miss. Princess. It was the child I'd sent for the doctor. Me mum, she's the one attending to that lord now. She says he's got a fair to middling chance of making it, and if he pulls through the night, he could live another 20 years. Except nobody knows if he'll ever be really himself again, because he can't move one of his arms and one of his legs, and half his face doesn't move neither. But the last words came out in a rush. Me mom says he wouldn't be alive at all if you hadn't sent for help so quick and made sure he could breathe and all. The child stood back on her heels, looking at me doubtfully, as if afraid I might punish her for speaking. Unnecessarily long. Princess. You know what? Yeah. Ugh. Okay. What was I? Okay. The girl stood back on her heels, looking at me doubtfully, as if afraid I might punish her for speaking. Also, I do her voice like sometimes I do like normal, and sometimes I do it like a little like royally. And I'm just like, I need to find a balance. Because she is a commoner, but also, so that's why I'm trying to work out right now, because I know I've kept her voice like two separate. I think both is good, but it's just like, I don't know, man. Anyway. The child stood back on her heels, looking at me doubtfully, as if afraid I might punish her for speaking. Thank you. The hoity-toity nobles? Thank you, I said. I hope somebody else thanks you too for running to help so quickly. You're really the one who saved Lord Reston's life. The girl hunched her shoulders modestly. That's what me mom says. I felt the familiar stab of envy, hearing someone talk about a mother who obviously loved her. My own mother had died when I was born, and my father said it hurt to talk about her. So I had let it. So I had very little in the way of secondhand memory. Uh, so I had very little in the way of even secondhand memories. Certainly, Lucille was no substitute for a loving mother, and I'd lost my father too. I dragged myself out of self pity and directed my attention back to the child. Her dirt covered hair cut with a ragged cir- was caught in a ragged circle around her face, and her cheeks and hands were so grubby it was hard to tell how long ago they'd been washed, if ever. And somehow her nose was too big and her mouth was too small. No one could miss her. No one could mistake her purpose in life to be providing brute. No one would mistake her purpose in life to be providing beauty, but her eyes were lively and quick, and I found myself looking at them and forgetting the rest. What's your name, child? I said. I asked. Mary. Well, well, I guess you know who I am, I said. How about if we make a deal? If you get a chance, could you let me know tomorrow how Lord Reston is doing? You're the first person who's been honest with me. I don't have anything with me now, but I'm sure I can come up with some reward for you. Mary giggled. Oh, that doesn't matter. I just thought you'd want to know. I've heard you. I heard you ask at the table. Don't don't that Madame Bissette beat all? Don't that don't that Madame Bissette beat all? Yeah, it's said weird, but I think you know what. Okay. I kept on hearing like doorbells, and I'm like, who the fuck is ringing the doorbell? We don't even have a doorbell. But no, my parents are watching Family Feud. Don't that Bissette beat all? Mary's pronunciation of Madame was actually better and more French sounding than mine. She probably knew more about palace protocol too. I squinted thoughtfully. Mary wasn't more than 4 or 5 years younger than me. It didn't seem fair that I was now a princess and she would always be a servant, just because I looked a little prettier than her. Just because I looked a little prettier than her. Madame Bassett does beat all, I agreed. You won't get in trouble for talking to me, will you? Are you kidding? Mary said. Not as long as you don't mind. All right then, I started, when someone called from down the corridor. Princess, see you tomorrow. I see you tomorrow, I told Mary. I went off to my needlepoint feeling a little cheerier. That evening was my time to meet with the prince. We had an hour together. We had an hour together just about every other night, depending on his schedule. I saw him at the banquet table every night, of course, and that was often from a distance, because the seating chart always changed. In the beginning, they always placed me with Madame Bassett and my other instructors, so they could correct any horrifying error I made before it attracted too much attention. I could tell someone thought I was learning something because in the last few days I had occasionally gotten to sit near people who hadn't heard anything but the castle's official story that I was a foreign princess who disguised herself as a commoner, because I wanted to win the Prince Charming's love on my own merits, not because of my father's vast lands. I thought anyone who believed the castle's official story had to be several logs short of a roaring fire, but nobody asked me. Now I sat in the prince's vast antechamber, waiting. The protocol of these visits was strictly regimented. Someone, usually one of my older and therefore more mature ladies in waiting, had to walk me down the hall and make sure there was a chaperone in attendance. My lady in waiting would curtsy and discreetly remove herself. Then the door to the prince's bedchambers, a place I'd never seen, would open, and I'd catch my breath and try to make conversation with the prince and the man. Uh, I'd catch my breath and try to make conversation with the prince, the man I was going to marry. I studied the tapestry on the wall, a dramatic scene of huntsmen killing a wild boar. There were dogs yapping at the boar, blood pouring from his sides, a nobleman with a sword poised above him, ready to deliver the final thrust. Women must have stitched this gory scene. Needlepoint wasn't for men. How did that fit with Madame Basset's notion that women must be protected from all unpleasantness? I dismissed her ideas as too silly to even think about. Behind me, tonight's chaperone, an ancient retainer of a king of the kings, snuffled. He sounded like he had had a bad cold. The candles sputtered in their sconces. The old grandfather clock by the door donged 8 times. Not 12, not midnight. Not 12, not midnight, the hour I had dreaded and run from on the most exciting evening of my entire life. Remembering the ball, I remembering the ball, I almost missed the opening door. And then there was the prince in all his glory, blue, clear blue eyes, his high cheekbones, rugged jaw, blonde hair precisely the right length because it was cut every fourth day by the royal barber. Tonight, the prince was wearing a deep blue waistcoat that exactly matched his eyes and showed off his muscular chest and trim waist. My heart quickened, as as always. Dizzily, I thought back to a summer afternoon years ago, before the Seth Beevils entered my life, when several of the other girls in the neighborhood and I were wading in the creek behind her house, talking of whom we would marry. This is Posh, Vina, a gloomy girl none of us really liked, muttered. We'll all settle for whoever asks us. We'll just be lucky if we don't get someone like my dad. Her father was a well-known ne'er-do-well, who spent most of his time in the village tavern. Not me, I said. I won't settle. If the right person doesn't ask, I won't marry at all. Some of the girls gasped, I remember. What could they have said if I'd vowed to, what would they have said if I'd vowed to marry a prince? Now I murmured, Your Majesty, trying to sound properly dignified and feminine and loving. I bent forward and extended my hand for kissing. Charm took it and the brush of his lips on my skin sent shivers down my spine. Princess, he said. His voice was low and deep, just as you would expect. Perfect, like everything else about him. He sat down beside me, his his left leg a scant inch from my skirt. Have you had a good day? Have you had a good day? I asked. Yes, he said. And you? I hesitated. Had he heard about Lord Reston? Would I be violating some etiquette rule by bringing up his condition? If I didn't know if Prince Charming realized that Lord Reston was tutoring me, or if Prince Charming even knew who Lord Reston was. No wonder I kept making so many gaffes. I never thought to ask the important questions until it was too late. And tonight, I decided the less said, the better. My day was fine, Your Majesty, I murmured. Good, he said. The chaperone coughed behind us. The the clock ticked, and I saw the time. I saw the time on its face, 8:03, and already Prince Charming and I had run out of things to say. I often wished during these stiff meetings that I could skip ahead in my life, past the glorious wedding, to maybe a year from now, and then after many hours together without a chaperone, I could picture the prince and me cuddling closely on these cushions instead of sitting stiffly an inch apart. We'd share our deepest thoughts and dreams, forgetting there was a castle or a kingdom or anything outside our love for each other. We'd call each other Charm and Elle, not Majesty and Princess. So far, I'd called Prince Charming Charm only in my mind. Prince Charming gave me an innocent, adorable smile. He didn't seem to realize that the chaperone made me feel awkward, or that the silence between us was uncomfortable and unnatural. Charm and I hadn't talked much the night the ball. Uh, Charm and I hadn't talked much the night of the ball either, but then we didn't need to. When we danced, he kept one hand just the right spot of the small of my back, gently guiding me. His other hand held mine. We looked into each other's eyes, and then it seemed he already knew everything about me. He didn't let me dance with anyone else. He whispered in my ear, "You're the most beautiful girl here." Hey, I was as susceptible to flattery as the next girl. Sometimes he still told me I was beautiful, but it wasn't like he was really paying attention. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. He jerked his head toward me, jolted by the urgency of my in his voice. "The hunt," he said, then looked puzzled. I may have surprised him in telling the truth, into telling him to, into telling him the truth. I may have surprised him into telling the truth. "You went hunting today?" I said, trying to coax more out of him. "Did you catch much?" The word catch sounded odd. Back home, we used to talk about catching fish. That's what I was thinking of. But the deer and the wild boars and other animals worthy of royalty's attention weren't caught. Should I have said killed? Were ladies allowed to say that? How could Prince Charming and I ever talk the way I wanted to? No holds barred, our thoughts as close as our bodies had been at the grand ball. If we couldn't even use the same words, if we couldn't use if we couldn't even use the same words. The prince smiled indulgently. "Don't trouble your mind about that," he said. "The kingdom is in fine shape. Why, we throw away food here at the castle that would be a feast in Suwala." Suwala was a neighboring kingdom. We had been at war with Suwala for as long as I could remember. So maybe the prince was only showing bravado, the way street urchins brag about the number of maggots and the bread they steal. But still, I wondered. Murdered? Yeah, murdered. But still, I wondered. "Why?" I asked. "Why throw away food when some of your own subjects go when some of your own subjects go hungry each night? Why? I myself know. Why, I myself know. The prince toyed with the ringlet that had escaped from the ribbon holding my hair in place. He wrapped and unwrapped my long blonde curl around his finger, around his fingers. I wished my hair had feeling. I wished he were touching my hand instead. I couldn't remember what I was going to say. I couldn't remember what I was going to say, I knew. The prince chuckled. So my princess worries about the poor, he said. If it pleases you, I'll order that our table scraps be set outside the palace gate each evening. It's that easy? I asked. Just like that? The prince shrugged. Why not? It matters not to me. He smiled, and I should have smiled back, given him the gratitude he deserved. But his last words stopped me. Why didn't his own hungry subjects matter to him? What was wrong with this man? And that is the end of chapter 4. Can I do chapter? Oh no, chapter 5 is a little long. I'm just like, I don't want to read anymore. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But yep, that's how the princey is. Alright, gotta stop recording. Thank you so much.